So get yourselves seated. We'll start in a couple of moments just to let everyone who's turning up, gone to go to coffee or whatever, turn up, and we'll be speaking to you shortly. Bear with us. Great, so I can see us still piling in, which is good to see everyone. If you've just joined, thank you for joining. I think we can get started though. So Marcus, do you want to take us away?
Thank you, Anthony, and welcome everybody to this webinar around Introduction to Data on Kubernetes. We will dig into the basics today and get you as a beginner started on how to approach storing data on Kubernetes as opposed to earlier ways of doing this. We'll walk you through the benefits and challenges of getting started with this, covering both Kubernetes and OpenShift. This is one of 3 webinars, so the skill level will increase over those 3 webinars, and you'll get all the knowledge you need around why you should look into storing data on Kubernetes or why you shouldn't do this. I'm Marcus Lind, one of the co-founders of Miradot and also the CEO. Technical background, but not as deep as the engineers in the Miradot team. Yep, that's about me. Over to you, Anthony.
Hi, so welcome everyone. So I'm Anthony Hodson. I am a Portworx cloud native architect. My architecture career goes back quite a way. I started playing with public clouds probably about 10 years ago, back when Rackspace were talked about in the same breath as AWS. So that's the architecture side. Personally, I studied as a software engineer. That took me through university, and then I did a bit of time in the financial software industry. Learned to be very careful what I typed into those machines. And lately, I've also been in the DevOps software space from the likes of Chef, so understanding what makes organizations move faster, which is something that we'll draw on in this. And I've been at Portworx for coming up to a year now. It's been really enjoyable to see all the development that goes into this product and how customer-centric we are. So I hope to share with you today. Our contact details are there. If you'd like to reach out, I always welcome a connection. I try to share things that are of value to you. But Marcus, I wonder if you'd like to talk a little bit about Miradot's place in the market and how you help people.
Sure thing. So we started out as a consultancy company in 2016, but has then developed ourselves. So now we're focusing on delivering and driving digital transformation with our customers. So that combines a few different areas. So we are trying to deliver both technology, and change the way you're using that technology, And to do that, we always try to simplify the interaction with the IT infrastructure itself. We have also realized that there are a lot of investments done in technology today from different vendors and different platforms or cloud vendors, and that the customers have a hard time getting use of all the features and benefits that are delivered with those technologies. So we always try to get the most use of the technology investments that has already been done, and that we combine into the saying, unlocking the untapped potential in your technology. We have been focusing on automating in IT infrastructure for a couple of years now, and that led to us being the first Cisco DevNet specialized partner in the world. And we have also managed to combine the three different pillars of digital transformation, which, if you ask us, are culture, processes, and technology. And we have then put it all together in a way of delivering this so that you can really get the potential out of your IT investments. Yeah, that's the story of Miradot. Back to you, Anthony. We can't hear you, Anthony, or at least I can't.
Thank you. The benefits of cameras. We can't take everyone here through, and there's 54 of you on the call at the moment, which I appreciate, through an introduction. But what I would like to do is get a little bit of info about you using this link. So it's 3 clicks once you're in there. It works really nicely from your telephone. You can click through very, very easily there. So if you can have a quick look at that while we go through, it's just going to give us an idea of where your alignment is, where your primary alignment is. So of those outcomes that everyone wants in a business, right? Cost reduction, growth, and reducing risk, you know, those always come down in an order. And what I'd like to understand from you is which order that comes down for in your role, so locally. And then we can have a little look at what the makeup of the organization is. And the reason I ask is because I think my view of the world is that we have a CTO who are looking to do better things, right? What can we do with technology that changes the things we can do? And then a CIO who's more internally focused on what can we do better? How do we make the most of what we have? Both these things aligned. I am married to a psychologist. This makes my life difficult at times, but you know, the way people think about these challenges are different, and people have ways, tendencies to go towards one or another as well. So very interesting to see where you guys come along. So the rest of today's talk will cover in part the 3 outcomes, and you'll notice the gains here are really trade-offs, and that seems a bit unintuitive, right? Normally you get one, you go with another, but we're going to see how that's not always the case, and there's a lot of data around this actually, and you might expect that working in an industry that's data rich. We've applied those rigorous activities to improving, right, to digital transformation, to accelerating as well. And also we see how Kubernetes fits into this and how Portworx can also aid in that. So let's have a little look at this poll, and I will try and work this interface nicely. Just refresh my screen here and we'll see how it's going. Bear with me. Okay, so you should be able to see a screen here. So we've got minimize risk as the primary goal here, which isn't what I was expecting actually. So that's fantastic. What's the phrase? When the information changes, change, something like that. So thank you for sharing that. So 56% of you are looking to minimize risk, and the second priority is to reduce costs. Okay, and I imagine that means that most of you align with the CIO in the organization, but let's find out. So none of the above was the one that got the most clicks and the CTO. So it seems to have blown up my theory. I'll have to take that back to the drawing board. But thank you for sharing that data point with me. Let me switch back to my presentation. Here we go. Right. So we have a quote often comes back to, right? I'm sure it's a quote you use with your customers as well. Every company is a software company. Now, Satya, I'm not sure was the first to say it. I'm pretty sure he wasn't, but Wikipedia believes that he is. So we're going to run with that one. And whether you're a company who wholly believe it, that you're a software company, or whether you're like my neighbor, runs a small book shop, he's managed to remove a lot of his staff from his operational costs and automate a lot of it, right? He's a small single business owner and he's a software company. I'm sure if you were selling biscuits on the street, you could use software automation to help that with things like social media. So I think everyone here today is in a company that would define itself in those terms as a software company. Now, the bit that you might not have heard of is that software delivery predicts organizational performance. And that predicts word is important and it's hard to come by. So the author of this, Nicole, she's got lots of talks on around DevOps and things on YouTube if you want to look into her research. She's also got this book, Accelerate, and she's gone into a lot of detail working with the likes of Gene Kim, who wrote the Phoenix Project, and Jez Humble, who wrote a book on a couple of books on CI/CD, which really moved the needle forward as well on how we do things automatically to improve things like productivity of the company, but also how much joy your developers get from doing things that are new and interesting, and your operations team get to solve actual problems rather than running around with that fire hose fighting fires that really gets you no closer to the long-term goal. So what we've learned from this is that IT used to be thought of as a cost center, so something you had to do to stay in the race. But actually, we've learned from this that we're either an engine or with a transmission to development's engine to move the company forward. And I think, as someone who's been in this industry for a long time, that that is really an empowering message and one that should be shared. So I hope you take this forward and can point to this research today to share that with your stakeholders. Now, containers. I imagine that most of you have come across containers, but a bit of a refresher into what they are, how they came about, and what the ultimate value proposition is here. So we're all familiar with this idea of a three-tier application. It was famed for its simplicity because you could write and maintain it, and most of those things would sort of fit in your head. When I was back in the financial services software company, someone would know about a pillar of a product. You know, it interface with the database. It would have some way of aligning where you get to that information through a front end, and you'd have the business tier that did that work, right? These things were hard to orchestrate the updates of, and here were some of those challenges, right? So you had to know everything to change anything. You had to upgrade everything all at once in that pillar. If it was busy, it was broken because bits of it didn't scale independent of the other bits. Often we saw workarounds like sticky sessions. So if you had a sticky session, that would mean that should the host you were running on fail, it would lose all the context that was operating in, right? So it would always send you back to that one, which also creates a bottleneck. We had a lot of NFS file shares and a big old central database that was very expensive, managed by some very big companies who held people to cost, held their feet to the fire with cost. So we changed from that, right? We moved to a monolithic microservices approach. And there were various software changes that came along that path, such as SOAP and things like that. But we're breaking things down and we're creating contracts between these pieces, say, I expect this of you and you will do this. And then those pieces can be reused and things like that. So we have what was a three-tier is broken into many tiers, right? Could be 20, could be whatever. And this seems on the outside as a nightmare, but actually when systems are loosely coupled and the interfaces are well understood, things become scalable. And we've seen this with things like the Amazon website, right? That's made up of thousands of pieces and it works pretty well together. And I'm not sure if we went back in time, we would be able to see that sort of development even appear in those old ways of doing things. that's one look at why you would do it, to increase that developer velocity. But there's more to it, right? You can also reduce the costs of this. And you can see in that photo, that picture, that we've come down about 25%. I tried to make it exactly 25% of the original scale. And that's for a reason. IBM say that they see, so this is running on OpenShift, that they see containerized workloads remove 75% of the costs involved. And that's not just your hardware, that's the amount of time and energy it takes to maintain these things, to stand them up. And this fits into that wider picture of digital transformation and automating things that you don't want to do, that don't differentiate, and we'll talk more about that soon as well. Now, speaking to my customers who are very in this world, they say that they see this as often a low estimate. And I think there's a certain amount of scale you need for OpenShift as well. So you can get beyond that as well, especially if you're looking at the hardware side, because that compaction is so available when you bring these things down. So you don't have to take my word for this. So we know that software delivery predicts organizational performance, but McKinsey and Company looked into high performing banks and retailers. They looked at 5 of them, each with a 20 billion turnover, and they tried to work out what made it work for them. Now, these are big organizations, and when we think back to the early days of DevOps, we didn't think big organizations could move this quickly. And it really speaks to the ability of the processes, right, that they can be adopted at this sort of scale and really make a difference. But what they found that gave this velocity, and this is in that same sort of vein as the Accelerate book, is that if you standardize on a few tools to give consistency, that aligns with success. If you cater for data and security, so making sure that those things flow freely, I mean, restrain the security side, right? But that those things are taken care of, you can then have better outcomes for the organization. And, you know, around all of this is that it's not an IT project, because we know that affects the outcome of the business. So the business has to get behind this as well. This is the future of what you as a company are doing. Now, of these 20 billion turnover banks and digital transformations, we found out a few things. So start by articulating the cloud's impact on the business metric, from increased agility to speed of innovation, not as a technology initiative, right, with goals such as increased infrastructure efficiency. Now, I may take my wife out to a nice dinner because she asked, but it doesn't mean I should say that's the reason, right? So we have to make sure that we're investing in things that are very meaningful for our business, and that is that velocity, right? That flywheel that moves things along. Here we go. So ABN AMRO were one of these banks, and they saw a 33% increase in productivity and 95% reduction in testing time. And that testing really drags you down. That's your technical debt. That can be something that as you develop further, if you don't solve that, that will stagnate your improvements. And then an 85% reduction in launch time for new customer features, right? So you get happier customers, you get bigger market share, and your developers are working on stuff that moves their needle forward. So that's good too. Now, we are seeing a lot of development in containers. And if we look at this bell curve, this adoption, I should say, likes of Crossing the Chasm by Geoffrey Moore, we can see that we're probably at the top of this curve now. We're about to see more and more adoption go in when we look at the organizations that are taking this up. And we will see, for example, 81% of organizations work with at least 2 clouds. And we are also seeing organizations repatriate workloads. So we can see that migration and mobility is going to be very important too. Now, I promised you an explanation of when I wouldn't containerize things, and I want to bring this to your attention now. When we start at the top of this list, these are important. And as we go down this list, you could containerize these things. It might make sense, but they're less clear-cut reasons to do it. So we'll talk about that. This comes from my experience working in the likes of AWS. I was an AWS architect for 5 years. where I saw a lot of things that were happening in the cloud, and we're going to talk about some of those now. So let me just make sure I can see what you can see. Yes. So when PaaS is a good solution, and it fits your strategy, then if you can get someone else to run something for you and it doesn't cost materially more and the service is good enough, right? Delegate that. That's what Geoffrey Moore calls core versus context. If it's not differentiating you, get someone else to do it. And there are solutions that can help with that all across the internet and in our services as well. Functions as a service, this idea that you don't pay for the idle of a system. It does something, it shuts down, and that's done. Now, behind the scenes, and this is something like Lambda in AWS, it's using containers. So there's scope for you to do something there if you really want to. But this means that you can build very scalable systems into these event-driven architectures. And that we see more for greenfield development. But for anything that you've got already written and you want to move into cloud and you want to begin to iterate, containers is probably a better play. But have a look at functions as a service as well. We talked about Geoffrey Moore here as well. So do things that differentiate your company. Maybe leave the things that you're going to containerize that don't differentiate at the back of that queue, right? Do those when it makes sense, when you've got the skills in-house to do that easily. The first things you should containerize are the things that are meaningful to your business and will differentiate you and build that flywheel for you. VMs, you can move VMs into containers. If they're very big and they look like VMs, then there's limited benefit to that. If you can shut down a data center or shut down your VMware cloud, then you might want to do that because that's going to save you some money. It's going to save some complexity. But if you're just moving what looks like a VM into a container, then you're not going to get all the benefits of containerization. And finally, Windows containers. Windows is coming up through the container landscape, but it is still fairly young. So if you're going to start on that container journey and you're just doing Windows, by all means. But if you've got a load of Linux first, I would start with that. It's a much more developed ecosystem for that.
Question there, Anthony. Do you have any insights on when customers decide between remodeling a application and move it into a containerized world, and when they decide to let it live in a VM, for example, for several years or something like that?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you, Marcus. That's a great question. I did a proof of, I did a launch with AWS for their app to container program, right? So there are automations out there that will bring it from one to the other. I think if you can't get the developer of the application to give you containers, then you've got to do some work yourself, right? So that work has to be worthwhile for you moving it. If you've got some assets in your data center that you're sweating, you just want to get the value from them, and the benefits of you moving them and the work that goes into that isn't going to pay for itself, then you might want to leave that. Now, the context that this sits around really changes things, because you could be saying, well, we're going to shut down our data center and we just want to move it into public cloud, into another data center. We want to make that nice and easy for ourselves. And that would change when you would do it. But it's often with containers, the opportunity cost of doing the thing that you're thinking of doing. If you did something else, would that be more valuable to your business, right? You've got to be the right kind of greedy in your company to make this work. And it could also be quite complicated to do. So definitely start with things that are meaningful to the business, but don't start with the thing that's most complicated and most meaningful to your business as you cut your teeth on this stuff. Thank you for the question. Hopefully that answered it.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Great. Let's see. Okay, this slide isn't moving on. Right. So Kubernetes. So we've got a little poll for you here. Anshia, I think, is on the line, and she's going to send that in. That's going to ask you about your experience of Kubernetes. So whether you're running it in production, whether you're doing stateless things in there or stateful things in there today. So if you can have a quick answer of that while I talk to you. But basically, the way I would explain Kubernetes is you've got all those pieces of your application, you need to run them somewhere. And the pieces that run together need to be able to connect, they need to be monitored, they need to work together, and it has to be in an enterprise way so that you're not worried about things falling over. You should do things like self-healing. And this is a bit like what we've seen with public cloud, something takes care of that. And that's what this was bought in for. It was built by Google. There's a really good documentary on that. I'll show you a slide from that in a moment. Just search Kubernetes documentary. It's made by Honeypot, I believe. And it was made to be massively scalable. The first real app that went on it was Pokemon Go. And that had a real big impact, right? And it scaled very quickly. But watch the documentary, it's a good watch. We've got a great ecosystem for it, right? Loads of development tools and ways of operating this, and the adoption is very wide in the industry. So we'll come back to some of those answers for the containers, your polls shortly. So we've got this idea of stateful and stateless applications. And to be honest, this can be a difficult thing to think about. It seems easy, but what we find is people have attached state to stateless applications for the benefit of the people running the platform, because then they can get information out of it, right? And that becomes a source of revenue quite often, or a source of innovation. So if we've got stateless apps, we do have many apps that are stateless, but they tend to do very discrete things, and then they pass on something else. So a VoIP system, for example, doesn't hold what you've been doing natively. It'll just do it and send it on. Or an encryption in transit system shouldn't hold on to the packets that go over. They just send them out. If we look at stateful apps, the things that you're most familiar with, you'll see those, right? So the likes of a retail website and databases all come under that umbrella. And as I said, right, if you've got data, you can get to wisdom, and then you can get some benefits from that. But it also comes with a responsibility, right? Encrypt like everyone is watching, for example. Okay, great. I think we can hear you, Antje. If you
yeah, sorry, I think we have 90% who already answered. So I will now close the call. And can you see it?
So yes, so we've got 42% are running in Kubernetes. We've got 7% are planning to this year, and 51% are looking into it. So that's a nice spread. There is another poll that follows this, just to go really into those who are running it. So if you take a look at that as well. Now this is very timely here. People have told me, and I believed it myself at one point, that Kubernetes is not for running state. This documentary that I mentioned really clears it up. They didn't have time to implement it in that first version, but it's not that they thought it shouldn't be done. So you can bring some trivia there if you're ever given that opinion. But as I said, it's a good documentary. So we know how many of you are running it in production now, with 40, I think it was 45% of you. And I wanted to show you the ways that you could do this. And my manager, good friend as well, he used to work at Docker, and they used to say, look, you're going to attach some NFS and you're going to pipe in a database. And that was it, right? That's how you did Kubernetes. That's how you got going with containers. But that left some efficiencies behind, right? And we'll talk about those. So what we find then is there's another way of doing it, rather than leaving all that state outside of the system, outside of Kubernetes. We can wire storage up to it. Now I've shown Pure Storage here. We do good things for Kubernetes in Pure Storage. We've developed that further for Portworx. Just to give you some context there, Portworx was bought by Pure Storage a couple of years ago. And so we have deeper integrations into Pure Storage, but Portworx will work with any storage. So the challenges of wiring storage to servers is that your apps and infrastructure, you know, they might live together, but things are tightly coupled. And as we discussed earlier, tight coupling leads to fragility, leads to unintended complexity, and you know, it just makes it harder to do things that you want to, that align with that velocity. And also you have to solve what I would call non-functional requirements, such as things being available. So if you think about SRE, server reliability engineer, it's right there in the title of that role. They want things to be available. They want things to be reliable. You need to make sure that things are automated so they come back up if, say, one of those arrays fail, which wouldn't happen, of course, because it's pure storage. But you know, you've got to build for these issues coming down the track. Now, the way Portworx solves this is that we abstract the infrastructure from the application, and we do so with the storage here. So we have a storage pool. We will take any storage that's given to that in file, block storage that goes into that, and then we can issue out NFS, so file, or block up to the containers, because containers still need something to store their data in, right? If you're doing stateful things in there. Now, do you, I'll ask this one rhetorically, but do you think that the company would be more successful if you did run the state in Kubernetes, right? Would it improve the bottom line by some worthwhile amount? Have a little think about that and where you peg that, because we have got some data around this. Let me just check my slide in the background here. Okay, so data on Kubernetes is a report that goes into the findings of asking 500 plus users about their experience of running data in Kubernetes. And they found that over 80% of them attributed 6% of the revenue of their company to running state in Kubernetes. And the majority actually, you know, believed it was more than that. And I can see this delivering on those promises, going back to the velocity piece, right? By lifting the burden of management and allowing developers to move things with less labor into Kubernetes to get you to that supersizing of your business case for Kubernetes itself, right? So you can reduce those costs, so you can increase productivity of your teams, whether they're developers, whether they're operators, all good things. So we have seen that this improves the context of the business. Now, a very high level explanation of Portworx on Kubernetes, and in our next sessions, we'll dig into this deeper. But we are providing here a replication of 3 lots of the storage across the different storage locations. Those could be arrays, those could be on-server disks, they could be SSDs in those servers, which are probably the fastest storage you're going to get anywhere, right? And we replicate the data to make sure if one of those failure domains goes, that your data is copied somewhere else and it's safe. And we can do that across 3 failure domains. We can do it across 2 when that makes sense, because you might be using large arrays or you've got 2 sites, that sort of thing. So we can make sure that your application is up and running, and that the data that is written to it will be available to it. And if there's any sort of problem where the Postgres database there needs to be respawned, it will be connected back to a replica of that data and spam back up in the matter of minutes. Most of that is noticing that there's a problem which comes from Kubernetes. So it can mean that you don't actually have to change the way your application works to move it into Kubernetes, which removes a load of work from your developers. And we'll get on to the other ways that we help as well.
So does Portworx only work with pure storage arrays?
Excellent question. So no, we started outside of pure storage, and we continue to work with any block storage available to us, so we can take it from anywhere. So that can be on the chassis, you know, some SSDs in the chassis, could be a NetApp array if you wanted to do that, anywhere like that. We'll take the storage, we'll present a layer over the top of it, so you just interact at the top end with Portworx, and down in the bottom end, we've got those connections to that storage. That's a great question, Marcus, thank you. So we've got that persistence layer. We've developed solutions on our persistence layer to solve other problems, like can you do zero data loss from one site to another site? Can you stretch a cluster so that you can fail over from one location to another in the same availability zones, which is often, in separate availability zones, which is often a limitation we see in public cloud, for example. Can you encrypt the disks? Can you encrypt the entire cluster's disks? Things like that. Enterprise challenges that Portworx Enterprise solves, these non-functional requirements that you get into as you start to run state in Kubernetes. And we draw on things we've learned from the past 60 years of doing data in systems, and they need to be solved. Beyond that, we also have a backup product, which allows application consistent backups. That's actually a standalone product, and we have a free version that allows you to do a terabyte of backup free forever. You have to bring your storage, but we'll provide the smarts in a SaaS offering, which we'll talk about in the next session as well. We also have a database as a service product, which allows you to do database as a service like you might get from AWS's remote relational database service, RDS. But instead of running in public cloud and doing it differently in each of the public clouds, you can do it the same everywhere and put it in any of those container runtimes in Kubernetes in any of the public clouds, including your on-premise as well. So this really means that you're not buying the cow, you're just buying the milk, right? You don't have to understand how to feed the cow and that sort of thing, right? That's taken care of. We just run those data services for you. Now, you don't need to take my word for this. We have a very good explanation of what we do and where the competitors are and where we're strong and where we need to develop. And we listen to this feedback from GigaOM. Think of them a bit like Gartner, but they're deeper into the container space than Gartner. You can see the bit.ly links there. That will be shown at the end as well if you want to dig into that report. The right-hand piece is how we perform with our storage, so pure storage, how that works in the container way. But that is more aligned with the infrastructure-centric way, with some of the benefits of Portworx itself as well. Now, when we look at the ways that we help organizations, parts of organizations, the value depends on that alignment we talked about earlier, but also on the role that they sit in. So for a DevOps team, it might be that they don't want to have to provision storage, they don't have to manage the storage, they want all that to be automated, and they want to provide database as a service because otherwise shadow IT is going to happen. So that might be the benefit for them. For IT, it's to provide the same storage everywhere, irrespective of the platform it sits on. So whether you're using OpenShift or whether you want to do something in Azure, you want to make sure that you have the same constraints, you have that consistency, and you can run the platform in the same way, because we see a lot of multi-cloud, we see a lot of desire to move things around, repatriation and so on. We have a large number of clients, many over 50% are global enterprises, particularly strong in the finance industry. I think that goes back to those industries understanding the benefits of digital transformation and then doubling down on it. And here's an example of that as well through Royal Bank of Canada. Not many banks will talk about what they do. This one talks about it. And this is to give them a zero data loss. So we won't lose any bits of what you were doing, because the first rule of banking is to know who owes you money, right? So we don't want to lose that. And this can go from a primary site to a secondary site with zero data loss in the event of an outage. And we can have that secondary site up and running within 2 minutes, which is, this wasn't really possible before in the container world. So this is a really USP for us in Portworx. And, it solves a really discrete business need. When you get to the point where you're going, actually, how do we do these complicated things? It can help there. Another example is Audi. So Audi were having challenges with the limitations of the storage that attaches to public cloud in AWS. They had to do things like thick provisioning. They weren't using all the data, but they weren't using all the storage, but they were certainly paying for it. And there were limitations on the number of attachments, and it was clunky. And if things fell over, they had to do manual work. We removed that for them and saved them 60% of their cloud spend on storage, I should say. Now, OpenShift and Red Hat, we work very closely with Red Hat. We work very closely with IBM. We develop things for their cloud as well, for example. We have a very detailed document here. I've flashed up another bit.ly QR there, which goes into how you deploy things in Red Hat OpenShift using Portworx. This has been validated with the Red Hat team as well. We co-authored this document. So if you want to dig into that deeper, we can get you looking at that link, or feel free to talk to us about it as well. That's the end of my explanation today. In the next sessions, we'll go deeper into some of these features. I will say, if you feel like doing some trials, backup is a great place to start. I think you could do a lunchtime POC there, right? It's 2 commands to get backup in on your cluster, and you can get a 30-day free trial for as much data as you want. You can get a free forever trial on a SaaS offering, which gives you a terabyte there. And we also have the GigaOM report there that I talked about. There's some videos you can get onto YouTube, but my suggestion would be, in the next session, make a little bit of time for us and we'll take you through some of those features. I will show you some demos, we will answer questions and so on.
And if you can't hold yourself, of course, reach out to Miradot and we'll assist you accordingly.
Great stuff. So in the next sessions, we're going to be talking about backup in Kubernetes, how you keep everything online, decoupling that infrastructure from the storage. Automation, you might find that your team's doing a lot of configuring things that really doesn't need to be done, right? That can be policied and fixed. And then we'll take you through this SaaS offering for database. We call it Portworx Data Services. Beyond that, the final session in the series here is how we do DR, so that zero data loss piece, how we can do multi-cloud, how we can move things around, and what integrations we have to solve these problems. Like RBAC, how do you make sure you're not creating extra users? How do you do GitOps and things like that? So, and Marcus, I don't know if you want to talk about this vest or close it down for us.
Yeah, of course, you have the opportunity to win one of 3 heat vests. We're gonna have you, or at least 3 of you win. So it's getting warmer and warmer for every week now, but at least in Northern Europe, it's still a couple of months left with the cold. So please tune in for the next sessions and see you then.
Excellent. Now, I do have time to answer questions, so I will flip back to that slide. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat. We'll give you a minute or 2 to collect your thoughts and answer anything. But if you need to go, very much understood. And thank you for joining us today. I'm sure Antje, who is looking this over, will bring them to my attention if I've missed any.
I don't think this is anything.
Okay, if you do ask a question, we'll stay on and answer you directly. That's no problem.
I think there are a couple of questions here.
Excellent. What have you got?
So a few asked if the session is recorded and link is provided. And I know
Yes.
it's recorded, and I think we can send out the link, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah,
We'll
you will do.
That I think was most of the questions that haven't been answered, or at least isn't too late to answer now.
I will answer all of these questions regarding the one question is how to subscribe for the upcoming one. So we're sending out further emails for registration on the session 2 and 3. There's one question, I don't know if you already answered, Anthony or Marcus. What are some benefits of using your solution versus NormaDB like MongoDB?
Well, that's not necessarily an or. So PDS is able to do MongoDB. We're actually, one of the challenges of Mongo over the years has been that they've built their own cloud business, but that cloud business is mostly in cloud, right? So you can't do a managed MongoDB service in your cluster. Portworx Data Services allows you to do that. One thing you do get is you get operators coming into Kubernetes. So we install as an operator. The likes of Couchbase, for example, will be able to install as an operator into Kubernetes as well. That creates a link into, if you've got storage that is fragile, it will be built on that fragile storage. So although the database will install and it'll work, if that link gets severed, then you'll have a typical infrastructure problem to solve, right? When all of these containers come back up, and I've got, could be thousands of containers in hundreds of hosts, these drives will be needed to reconnect, and that can be a real headache. So Portworx can make it so that you can do that automatically. These things are solved automatically. So hopefully that's answers it. Anything to add, Marcus?
No, not onto that, but we have another question around if Portworx is supported with Tanzu, and I certainly believe that is.
Yes, you're totally correct. Yes, we work with Tanzu. We work with basically all of the platform providers who make running Kubernetes easier. I remember the memes going around a few years ago about people their business is failing, but then building brilliant Kubernetes clusters. The environment has built up now so that providers like Tanzu will give you these services, so you don't have to deal with all of the options that come from the way engineers build technology, right? The way Google built these technologies and released it to the world. So it's simpler. So we can solve that need for the extra expertise to run it yourself. We do have customers who run vanilla Kubernetes, but most of our customers we see on Red Hat OpenShift or public clouds as well. And we can cater for all of them. It's 2 commands to get this installed as well, so have a go.
We also have a question from Mustafa. Are there any options to run databases on Kubernetes on-prem and in cloud and replicate them in a master-slave manner?
Yes. So you start to get into the decision of where you're doing your resiliency, and you might find, I'm just going to get the whiteboard out. You might find that you're doing it down at the storage level. We see this quite often where someone's got, if I stop sharing for a second, stop showing screen. It might not be clear enough for you to see, right? But that would be a replica over there. That's going to connect up to Kubernetes. And then you've got in there, potentially, you've got a database, which is then going to replicate over to another database, possibly in a separate failure domain. Let's call that B. So, if you're replicating down here and you're replicating up here, there's no point doing that. So what Portworx does then is it says, okay, we're going to connect over to a layer down here that does all that replication for you. And you've got a database that if it fails, will be spun up on another node to solve your problem. So when you have ultimate scale and you need a database that's absolutely available, and the replication has been solved at the application tier, by the design of that database, then you might not need Portworx for that because that might be handling it. But architecturally, you have to solve that problem. The strength that Portworx brings is any database that is a single point of failure can be made resilient and easy to bring in. And if you do this as a platform as a whole, and then you do the ability to do backup and things like that, we can still solve this problem, but we can solve all the other database challenges as well for making sure it's available. And as I'll show you in the next session, we're looking at a minute, something around that, to get your database replacement up. And most of that is waiting for images to be loaded onto the replicas. which you can pre-warm. So speaking to clients, this failover between the primary and the secondary is often outrun by the automation that we provide, where you don't have to do that failover. So it can be solved that way. But these are two different ways to solve the same challenge. But what you want to make sure you're not doing is replicating at 3 or 4 different tiers, because you'd just be wasting storage, be wasting time, and it'll be more complex.
And then one last question that is somewhat similar to this one, but how does Portworx deal with region failure? And for example, an Azure region failure, can we able to access the data or PVC on another region, and what would be the solution that Portworx have for this multi-region functionality?
Yeah, so we have a couple of ways of doing this. So it depends on your restore time and your restore point objectives, as is always the case in these. So if we say this is in North America and this is in Northern Europe, you know, we've got a big gap between them. If we were to do some synchronous replication here between this host and this one, you need to get an acknowledgement back to say, I've done the thing, before it's committed something like an ACID database. That could potentially slow your whole application down to the point where it's useless. It doesn't deliver the needs. So if there's a big enough gap between them, you might have to accept some form of data loss. Some form of data loss, or you have to use a database that understands the idea of eventual consistency on some things, and then you wait for the system to accept to acknowledge the change and then put it back to normal. So if these are that far away, we have something coming out in version 3 called near sync. And near sync allows any 2 points that are within 150 milliseconds of each other around the world, providing you've got the bandwidth to do it, right? You've got to make sure that it's got to fit down that tube at the rate that it's going. But we can do 24 seconds RPO on anything anything around the world, basically, is the maximum RPO we would get to in an event where you have 2 data centers that are a long way away. Now, if you have data centers that are sub 10 milliseconds, we can forgo any data loss. So we can do that. So we can then make sure that your data is replicated over. And we'll get into the complexities of this in the 3rd session, so 2 sessions from now, as we look at DR. Another solution would be to be able to move between 2 data centers or even 2 clouds. So if this is AWS and this is Azure, you can't really move things between them with Kubernetes natively, but what we can do is we can take a backup of that into a bucket. There's a dodgy drawing of a bucket, and then restore from that bucket up to here, or vice versa, in the event of a failure. Of course, AWS's S3 service, I think it's got 11 nines of durability, so that's, I can't do that maths, but it's a lot. And we can go, unlike the likes of Ceph, for example, we can go from one to, Rook, we can go from one cloud provider to another with your backups and restore the whole thing really easily. So we can take backups as well. And those backups can be done across your cluster, or it could be just done on a namespace, and they can be done on a schedule, or they can be done before you do something that's a bit risky, right? Developers want a safety net as much as a trapeze artist, right? So we can do that as well. So there's various ways we can meet those demands, but they're common things for us to solve for our clients. I think that was a long answer. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Anthony. That was the last question.
Excellent.
Perfect.
Well, really, thank you for joining. If you stuck around this long, it looks like most of you have. If you want to get in touch, do get in touch, but I look forward to getting more questions from you on the next session. Thank you. Yeah, bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.